In Lagos, your pride is more expensive than your rent. At 33, I was the golden boy of Lekki, but I was a fraud. I was eating once a day in the dark, hiding from my landlord. When my girlfriend told me she was pregnant, I didn't celebrate. I begged her to kill it. I told her we couldn't afford a life while I was busy burying my chief father with money I didn't have. You're going to hate me for what I did next, but in this city, you either play God or you die a beggar. This is the truth about the year I lost my soul. Hello, welcome. You didn't find this by accident. These are stories of quiet courage, hidden truths, and people who chose heart over fear. If that pulls you in, please subscribe, tap the notification bell, and stay with us. Thank you. Lagos does not whisper your failures. It screams them from the rusted roofs of Danfo buses and the judging eyes of security guards who no longer salute when you walk past. At 29, Temi had been the architect of his own universe, a man who moved through the humid air of Lekki Phase 1 with the easy grace of someone who had never known a bad day. He remembered the crisp feel of starch in his shirts and the way the air conditioning in his Mercedes felt like a personal shield against the chaos of the city. Back then, manhood was a scorecard of bank alerts and bottle service at Carbon. He was the son of Chief Adeyemi, and although they hadn't spoken in years, the shadow of his father's prestige was a cloak he wore with arrogant ease. But the transition from 29 to 33 had been a slow-motion car crash, a series of bad investments, and village people luck that had stripped him down to a skeletal version of himself. Now, the Mercedes was gone, sold to pay off a debt that only grew like a fungus. His shirts were yellowing at the pits, scrubbed by hand, because the dry cleaner was a luxury he could no longer afford. He had learned the art of the Lagos walk, chin up, eyes forward, looking like a man with a destination when, in reality, he was just walking to avoid the heat of a room that had no electricity. The silence of his phone was the loudest thing in his life. The friends who once toasted his health had vanished like mist over the lagoon, leaving him with nothing but the echo of his father's stern voice reminding him that a man who cannot stand on his own is merely a boy in a costume. By the time the sun began to dip behind the unfinished skyscrapers, casting long, bruised shadows over the city, Temi was practicing the 0-1-0 formula, the desperate math of the hungry. One meal a day, usually at 4 p.m., designed to bridge the gap between the dizziness of the morning and the insomnia of the night. He sat in the dim light of his apartment, the walls closing in, nursing a single bowl of Gary and groundnuts like it was a 5-course meal at the wheat baker. He kept the lights off, not just to save what little units were left on the prepaid meter, but because the darkness was a kinder mirror than the light. He was a man of 33, crying like a child in the privacy of the shadows, the hot salt of his tears seasoning the sour water of his meal. He thought of his father, the chief, a man who had commanded rooms with a single cleared throat, and the shame felt like a physical weight on his chest, a heavy, iron chain that linked his failure to his DNA. He had spent his whole life trying to outrun the chief's shadow, trying to prove that he didn't need the old man's influence or his approval. Yet here he was, broken in the very way his father had predicted. He was a man who had been beaten in the streets of Lagos as a boy for mistakes he didn't commit and hadn't shed a single tear. Yet the crushing silence of an empty bank account had finally done what the canes of his teachers never could. He was drowning in the middle of a city surrounded by water. And the most terrifying part was that he had become an expert at pretending he was still swimming. The toughness of a Lagos boy is not born. It is forged in the heat of public squares and the sting of a leather belt that smells of old sweat and authority. Temi remembered the first time he was disciplined in the open air near the Ashidi markets, a misunderstanding involving a missing watch and a neighbor's accusation. He was 12, and the crowd had gathered with the practiced hunger of people who found entertainment in the correction of others. He remembered the feeling of the gravel biting into his knees and the rhythm of the blows, each one a sharp, stinging reminder that his body was not his own. His father, the chief, had stood at the edge of the circle, arms folded across his agbada, his face a mask of disappointment that hurt far worse than the strikes. A man does not flinch, his father had told him later that night. Not as a comfort, but as a commandment. If they see you bleed, they know they can break you. If they see you cry, they know they own you. That philosophy had become Timmy's skeletal structure. Through secondary school and the cutthroat hallways of the University of Lagos, he had been the Iron Boy. He took the bullying, the strikes from frustrated lecturers, and the betrayals of early business partners with a terrifying, stony silence. He wore his stoicism like armor, believing that if he never showed pain, the pain would eventually get bored and move on to a weaker target. He didn't realize then that armor doesn't just keep the world out. It traps the pressure inside until the metal begins to warp and crack from the internal heat. Now, at 33, the armor was no longer a defense. It was a coffin. The same Lagos streets that had taught him to be silent were now mocking that very silence. He walked through the markets where he once spent thousands, his pockets filled with nothing but lint and a folded-up eviction notice that felt like a hot coal against his thigh. He saw the boys being corrected in the streets and felt a kinship with them that terrified him. The shared understanding that in this city, you're only as valuable as your ability to endure. He thought about his father's house in the village, a sprawling estate built on the spoils of chieftaincy titles and land deals, and how he had vowed never to return there as a failure. The chief's voice was a permanent resident in his mind, a spectral commentator on his current misery. "Is this the man you said you were?" The voice would sneer whenever Timmy looked at the once-a-day meal on his table. "Is this the independence you fought me for?" The pride that had fueled his ascent was now the very thing preventing his rescue. He couldn't call his siblings. They were vultures in designer labels, waiting for a reason to pick at his bones. He couldn't tell Tenny, his girlfriend, the full extent of the rot, because to admit he was failing was to admit he was no longer a man by his father's definition. He was a Lagos boy, built of iron and grit, but even iron has a melting point, and the year before the dawn was turning up the heat until his soul began to liquefy. The phone call didn't come with a thunderclap or a dramatic shift in the atmosphere. It arrived as a vibration on a cracked screen at 3:14 a.m., a time when only bad news and ghosts travel the cellular waves of Lagos. Timmy had been staring at the ceiling, calculating the exact number of days he could stretch a bag of rice if he only ate 30 grains a day, when his mother's voice broke through the silence like a jagged blade. She didn't lead with hello or how are you. She led with a wail that carried the weight of 30 years of marriage and 1,000 unspoken grievances. "Temalayawa, your father has traveled," she said, using the traditional Yoruba euphemism for death that somehow made the finality of it feel even more permanent, as if the chief had simply boarded a flight to a destination where the roaming charges were too high for a return call. In that moment, the room felt like it was losing oxygen. The estrangement between Timmy and the chief had been a cold war of silence, built on a foundation of manly pride and the refusal to apologize for the paths they had chosen. Timmy had wanted to prove he could build a kingdom without his father's scepter, and the chief had been content to watch him struggle from the heights of his chieftaincy. Now, the opponent in this silent war was gone, leaving Timmy with a hollow victory and a crushing, suffocating blanket of regret. The words he had saved for one day, the apologies, the explanations, the simple admission that he actually admired the old man's strength, now had nowhere to go. They were orphans in his throat, bitter and heavy, turning into a lump he couldn't swallow no matter how hard he tried. The silence that followed the call was louder than the wail itself. Timmy sat on the edge of his bed, his toes touching the cold, dusty tiles of an apartment he was failing to keep. He realized with a sickening jolt that the chief had died, believing his son was still the high-flying tech consultant with the world at his feet. The facade he had maintained during their brief, infrequent calls, the lies about big contracts and expansion plans, now felt like a betrayal of the dead. He had been so focused on protecting his ego that he had robbed his father of the chance to see his son as a human being, vulnerable and in need of a father's hand. The chief was a man of the old guard, a man who believed that a son's success was the only metric of a father's worth, and Timmy had fed him a steady diet of curated success stories while his actual life was rotting from the inside out. Now, as the first son, the burden of the big Nigerian burial was hurtling toward him like a freight train. He was a man who couldn't afford a gallon of fuel for his generator, yet the world would expect him to host a funeral fit for royalty. The irony was a physical pain in his chest. He was about to become the center of a celebration of life while he was drowning in the middle of his own. He thought about the beatings he had taken as a boy, the way he had hardened his heart against his father's belt, and he realized that the hardest blow the chief had ever delivered was this final, silent exit. There was no one left to fight, no one left to prove wrong, and the emptiness was more terrifying than any confrontation he had ever faced. Hunger in Lagos has a specific personality. It is not a dull ache, but a sharp, calculating predator that sharpens your senses while eroding your dignity. For Temi, the 010 diet, no breakfast, a late lunch, no dinner, had become a ritual of survival that required the precision of a chemist. He would wait until 4:30 p.m., the golden hour, when the sun was low enough to make the heat bearable, but high enough that he could still see what he was eating without turning on the lights. He would walk to the small mama put stand 3 streets away, intentionally choosing a place where no one knew his name or recognized the brand of the faded designer shirt he wore. He would order a single portion of white rice and a small piece of titidus fish, asking for plenty of stew so he could drench the grains in flavor to mask the lack of substance. He ate with a slow, deliberate focus, savoring every grain as if it were a prayer. The psychological toll of hunger was worse than the physical. It made him irritable, prone to flashes of irrational anger, and strangely hyper-aware of the wealth of others. He would watch men in SUVs pull up to luxury supermarkets and feel a primal, dangerous urge to scream at them, to demand why the world was so tilted. But then he would remember his father's voice. A man provides, or he is a ghost. He was becoming a ghost, drifting through the city he once conquered, his stomach a hollow cavern that echoed with the sounds of his own failures. Maintaining the facade required more energy than he had to give. One afternoon, while nursing his single meal, he spotted an old colleague from his consultancy days, a man named Cunnel, who still wore the Lekki boy uniform of a crisp white shirt and an Apple Watch. Temi's first instinct was to hide, to duck behind a pillar or pretend to be deep in a phone call, but the Lagos iron in his soul wouldn't let him. He stood up, straightened his spine, and put on the mask of success he had perfected over the last year. They spoke for 10 minutes, a choreographed dance of lies where Temi spoke of pivot strategies and offshore investments, while his stomach let out a treacherous, low growl that he hoped Cunnel would mistake for the distant rumble of a generator. Cunnel looked at him with a mixture of suspicion and pity, perhaps noticing the way Temi's collar hung loosely around a neck that had lost its thickness. When they parted, Cunnel offered him a business card, mentioning a small project that might interest him. The shame of that offer, the subtle implication that Cunnel knew he was struggling, stayed with Temi long after the taste of the rice had faded. He walked back to his dark apartment, the card burning a hole in his pocket, and realized that his pride was a luxury he could no longer afford, yet it was the only thing he had left. He was a 33-year-old man who had once commanded rooms, now reduced to counting grains of rice and performing for people who didn't care if he lived or died. The 010 diet wasn't just about food. It was about the slow starvation of his soul, a daily reminder that the year before the dawn was going to be a long, cold night. The road to his father's village in Ogun State was a psychological gauntlet, a transition from the chaotic, familiar misery of Lagos to the deep, ancestral silence of the hinterlands. Temi sat in the back of a shared interstate Toyota Sienna, his knees pressed against the seat in front of him, surrounded by the smell of dried fish, cheap perfume, and the anxious energy of people moving between lives. As the urban sprawl of the city gave way to the aggressive green of the tropical forest, Temi felt the Lekki boy version of himself being stripped away. The further he got from the coast, the more he felt like the little boy who used to hide in the cocoa stores to avoid his father's temper. He watched the landscape shift, the red earth of the village roads rising up to meet the tires, and he felt a profound sense of dread. Returning home for a burial as the first son meant he was stepping into a role he hadn't auditioned for, the head of a family he had spent a decade trying to escape. He looked out the window at the roadside vendors selling boiled corn and plantain chips, and he wondered if they knew more about peace than he did. They had so little, yet they moved with a groundedness that he had lost somewhere between his first million and his last eviction notice. He was a man returning to his roots, not as a conquering hero, but as a fugitive from his own life, carrying a suitcase filled with debt and the heavy, unrefined grief of a son who had never truly known his father. When the car finally pulled into the family estate, the sheer scale of the chief's world hit him like a physical blow. The house was a sprawling, multi-winged testament to a life spent collecting titles and influence, massive pillars, ornate iron gates, and a courtyard already filled with the early arrivals of the professional mourners. His mother met him at the door, her eyes red-rimmed and her body looking smaller, more fragile than he remembered. She clung to him, and for a moment, the iron in his soul softened. But then she whispered, "Your siblings are already inside, Temmie. They're asking about the accounts. They're asking about the will." The warmth of the homecoming evaporated instantly, replaced by the familiar chill of family politics. He walked into the main parlor, where the portraits of his father, decked in full chieftaincy regalia, seemed to follow him with a judging gaze. His younger brothers, Yemi and Segan, were huddled in a corner with their wives, their hushed tones suggesting a strategy meeting rather than a morning session. They looked at him as he entered, their eyes scanning his clothes, his shoes, and his posture, looking for the cracks in his armor. They didn't see a brother. They saw a rival for a dwindling inheritance. Temmie stood in the center of the room, the first son in a house of strangers, realizing that the burial wasn't going to be a time for healing. It was going to be a battlefield, and he was entering it with no weapons and a heart that was already bleeding from a dozen different wounds. In Nigeria, a funeral is rarely about the dead. It is a high-stakes performance for the living, a circus of grief, where the volume of the wailing is directly proportional to the perceived social status of the family. The chief's burial was no exception. By the third day, the estate had been transformed into a festival grounds, covered in massive white marquees and the overwhelming scent of jollof rice cooking in giant iron pots over open fires. The air was thick with the sound of talking drums and the voices of praise singers who had memorized the chief's lineage, weaving stories of his greatness that sounded more like mythology than biography. Temmie moved through the crowds like a ghost at his own haunting. He wore the required lace asoebi, a fabric that felt like sandpaper against his skin, and smiled until his face felt like it would crack. He watched as local politicians and business titans arrived in convoys of black SUVs, their presence a calculated move to secure their own influence by associating with the legacy of the fallen chief. It was a staggering display of wealth, money being sprayed on dancers, expensive whiskeys flowing like water, and gold-trimmed souvenir programs that cost more than Temmie's monthly rent. The contrast was a bitter pill he had to chew slowly. He was presiding over a $1 million Naira event while his own bank account was in the negative, a king of a hollow mountain who couldn't even afford the air he was breathing. The hypocrisy of the event reached its peak during the night of tributes. One by one, men who had spent years undermining his father stood behind a microphone to speak of his unwavering integrity and gentle soul. Temmie sat in the front row, his hands clenched in his lap, listening to the fabrication of a man he didn't recognize. The chief he knew was a man of iron and thunder, a man who used silence as a weapon and expectations as a cage. As the praise singers chanted his father's name, Temmie felt a rising tide of anger. He wanted to scream at the crowd, to tell them about the boy who was beaten for not crying, to tell them about the son who was currently starving while they gorged themselves on his father's legacy. But the Lagos boy in him stayed silent. He knew that in this theater, truth was the enemy of tradition. He watched his siblings take the stage, delivering polished, tearful speeches that were clearly designed to position them as the rightful heirs to the chief's influence. They spoke of continuation and stewardship, their eyes occasionally darting toward the lawyers who sat at the back of the tent. It was a feeding frenzy disguised as a funeral. By the time the night ended and the last guest had stumbled toward their car, Temmie was exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. He stood in the darkened courtyard, the smell of burnt wood and spilled gin hanging in the air, and realized that the chief was truly gone, replaced by a caricature that everyone was eager to use for their own ends. He was alone in a crowd of family, the only one who seemed to remember that a human being had actually died. The morning after the main ceremony, the circus of grief folded its tents, leaving behind a graveyard of plastic chairs and the sharp, metallic tang of family resentment. The meeting of the heirs took place in the chief's private study, a room that still smelled of old leather, tobacco, and the unspoken authority of a man who ruled with a heavy hand. Temi sat at the head of the long mahogany table, a position he held by birthright, but occupied with a growing sense of imposture. His siblings, Yemi and Segan, sat opposite him, their expressions stripped of the performative sorrow they had worn for the cameras. Yemi, the middle child who had built a career in corporate law by leaning heavily on the chief's connections, opened a leather-bound folder with a clinical precision. "Let's be realistic, Temi," he began, his voice devoid of any brotherly warmth. "The estate is not as grand as the public thinks. There are outstanding debts to the community, land disputes in Egba, and several unrecorded beneficiaries who have already started calling. We need to liquidate the Lagos properties immediately." The word liquidate hit Temi like a slap. One of those properties was the very foundation of his father's pride, and the other was a small townhouse he had hoped might be a safety net for his own collapsing life. Segan, the youngest and most volatile, nodded in agreement, his eyes fixed on the gold watch that had belonged to their father, which Temi was now wearing. "We can't wait for sentimental value to pay the bills, brother. We need our shares now. Unless, of course, the big CEO from Lekki wants to buy us out." The sneer in Segan's voice was the catalyst for a fire that had been smoldering in Temi's chest for years. He looked at his brothers, men who had never known a day of true hunger, who had coasted on the chief's name while he had tried to forge his own, and saw the true face of his family. They weren't interested in preserving a legacy. They were vultures picking at a carcass before the blood was even dry. The argument that followed was a brutal deconstruction of their shared history. Secrets were weaponized. Yemi's failed business ventures that the chief had quietly funded, Segan's gambling debts that had been wiped clean with chieftainship favors. The room became a pressure cooker of blood and gold, where every memory was a transaction and every sibling was a creditor. Temi tried to speak of their mother's future, of the need to keep the ancestral home intact, but he was shouted down by the logic of greed. "You've been distant for years, Temi," Segan shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "You come here with your silent, judgmental face, pretending you're better than us. Where's your contribution to the burial? We paid for the caterers. We paid for the bands. You just showed up to take the first son's portion." The accusation stung because it was partially true. He hadn't contributed financially because he couldn't, and the shame of that reality made his defense feel weak. He realized then that he was truly alone. His brothers didn't care about his struggle, and he couldn't tell them the truth without giving them the final weapon they needed to destroy him. He walked out of the study, the sound of their arguing voices following him like a curse, realizing that the gold of his father's life was nothing but a catalyst for the shedding of blood. The actual interment was a stark, quiet affair compared to the week of madness that had preceded it. It was just the immediate family standing by the open grave in the private cemetery at the edge of the estate. The dust of the Ogun soil was a vibrant, deep red, the color of dried blood and old promises. As the casket was lowered, the reality of his father's mortality finally pierced the armor Temi had worn since the 3:14 a.m. phone call. He watched the polished wood disappear into the earth, and with it, the possibility of ever being good enough in the chief's eyes. The priest spoke of returning to dust, a theological truth that felt like a personal threat to Temi. If the chief, with all his titles and gold and iron will, could be reduced to a hole in the ground, what hope was there for a man like him, whose kingdom was already ash? He took a handful of the red earth, the grit feeling coarse and real in his palm, and let it fall. The sound of the dirt hitting the lid of the casket, a dull, hollow thud, was the loudest sound he had ever heard. It was the sound of a door closing forever. In that moment, the iron boy cracked. A single tear escaped, followed by another, until he was shaking with a grief that wasn't just for his father, but for himself, for the years wasted in silence, for the pride that had kept them apart, and for the terrifying uncertainty of the life he was returning to in Lagos. He waited until the others had retreated to the house to let the full weight of the collapse take him. He sank to his knees by the fresh mound of earth, the sun beating down on his back like a physical hand. He cried like a child, a 33-year-old man sobbing into the red dust of his ancestors, his cries muffled by the humid air. He apologized to the earth for things he couldn't name. He told his father everything he had been too afraid to say, that he was scared, that he was hungry, that he was failing, and that he missed the man who had once been his whole world. The silence of the grave was his only answer, but in that silence, something shifted. The performative masculinity he had inherited, the failing is not an option mantra that had nearly killed him, felt suddenly insignificant in the face of death. He realized that the chief's greatest failure wasn't his temper or his pride, but his inability to show his son how to be a human being instead of a monument. Temi stood up, his face smeared with dust and salt, and wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his expensive, useless lace. He felt lighter, but also more vulnerable than he had ever been. He had buried his father, but he had also buried the version of himself that lived only for the chief's approval. He walked back toward the house, knowing that the dawn was still nowhere in sight. But for the first time in a year, he wasn't afraid to look at the dark. Returning to Lagos after the burial was like waking up from a dream into a nightmare that had been patiently waiting for your return. The air in his Lekki apartment felt stale, a reminder of a life that was already in the process of being packed away. He hadn't even dropped his suitcase when he saw it, the red mark. It wasn't just a notice. It was a physical brand on his door, a bold, crimson-lettered "Notice Tio Quit" from the landlord's lawyers, pasted with a callousness that suggested he was already a nuisance to be cleared away. The legal jargon was a blur of default in payment and recovery of premises, but the message was clear. He had 7 days to disappear. The apartment, which had once been his sanctuary, his proof of success, had officially become a crime scene of his own making. He sat on the floor in the middle of the living room, the lights still off, the red mark on the door seemingly glowing in the dark. The irony was a bitter comedy. He had just buried a man who owned half a village, yet he was being kicked out of a 2-bedroom flat in a city that didn't know his name. The Lagos spirit he had once relied on felt like it had abandoned him, leaving him with nothing but the ticking of a clock he couldn't stop. The panic that followed was a cold, vibrating thing that settled in his bones. He began to pace the small space, his mind a frantic, trapped bird hitting the walls of his reality. He thought of calling his brothers, but the memory of the blood and gold, meeting in the study silence that impulse instantly. He would rather sleep under the bridge at CMS than give them the satisfaction of seeing him truly broken. He thought of his friends, but the 010 diet had already taught him that his social circle was built on the shifting sands of prosperity. Once the money stopped flowing, the invitations stopped coming. He was a man with a prestigious name and a red mark on his door, a paradox that Lagos produces with assembly line efficiency. He looked at his phone, his thumb hovering over Tenny's name. She was the only one who truly cared, the only one who had seen the real Timmy through the cracks in the armor, but the thought of telling her he was being evicted made him feel physically ill. His father's voice, now a permanent ghost in his head, sneered at his hesitation. A man who cannot keep a roof over his head is not a man. He gripped the phone until his knuckles turned white, the red notice on the door feeling like a countdown to his total erasure. He realized that the year before the dawn was no longer a metaphor. It was a literal fight for space in a world that was trying to squeeze him out. Tenny arrived at the apartment 2 days after the red notice. Her presence a burst of color and life in a space that had become a tomb of his own failures. She didn't comment on the notice. He had tried to scrape it off, but the red residue remained like a scar, and she didn't ask why he was sitting in the dark. She simply sat next to him on the floor, her hand finding his in the shadows. For a long time, they just sat there, the the silence of the room filled with the unspoken weight of their 3-year journey. Tenny was a woman of quiet strength, a schoolteacher who saw the world through a lens of hope that Temmie often found naive. But tonight, her hope felt like a threat to his misery. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper that carried the force of a landslide. "Temmie, I missed my period. I took a test. I'm pregnant." The world didn't stop, but it seemed to tilt on its axis. In the midst of death, eviction, and starvation, life had decided to plant a seed in the most infertile soil imaginable. The first seed wasn't a blessing to Temmie. It was a terrifying complication, a new mouth to feed when he was already counting his own ribs. He felt a surge of love for her, followed immediately by a wave of resentment for the timing, for the biology of it all, for the sheer audacity of hope in a year of ruin. The fear that gripped him was different from the fear of hunger or eviction. It was the fear of being the chief to a child who would grow up in the shadow of his failures. He looked at Tenny, her face illuminated by the faint light from the street lamps outside, and saw the flicker of joy she was trying to suppress for his sake. She wanted to be happy. She wanted to believe that this was the sign they needed, but Temmie could only see the 0-1-0 math applied to 3 people instead of 1. He saw the hospital bills he couldn't pay, the school fees that were decades away but already felt like a debt, and the look on his father's face if he could see his first grandchild being born into a house with a red mark on the door. "We can't," he said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. "Tenny, look at this place. Look at me. We can't have a baby now." The joy in her eyes didn't just fade. It evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard disappointment that hurt more than any beating he had ever taken. He was a man of 33, a protector by nature and by heritage, and he was telling the woman he loved that their child was a mistake of timing. The silence that followed was the darkest part of the year, a moment where the first seed felt less like a beginning and more like the final proof that he was a man who had lost his way entirely. The argument that followed Tenny's announcement wasn't loud. It was a low-intensity warfare of logic versus instinct, a difficult choice that pitted Temmie's survivalism against Tenny's faith. For 3 days, they existed in a state of suspended animation, moving through the apartment like 2 people sharing a life raft that was slowly taking on water. Temmie used every weapon in his arsenal of pragmatism. He showed her the bank statements with their mocking rows of zeros. He pointed to the eviction notice that he had finally managed to remove, though the tape marks remained like ghosts. He spoke of the chief's way, arguing that a child deserved a father who was already a man of substance, not a man in transition. "I don't want our child to know what it feels like to wait for 4:30 p.m. to eat," he told her, his voice cracking with a desperation he couldn't hide. Tenny listened with a stony, heartbreaking silence, her hands protective over a stomach that hadn't yet begun to show. She offered to move back to her parents' house, to take extra tutoring jobs, to do whatever it took, but Temmie's pride, the poisoned gift from his father, wouldn't allow it. To him, accepting her help while he was at his lowest was the ultimate admission of emasculation. He begged her to wait, to clear the path first, promising that they would have children when the dawn finally came. The day of the procedure was a gray, humid Tuesday that seemed to match the mood of the city. They walked into a small, private clinic in Yaba, a place that smelled of antiseptic and muffled secrets. Temmie felt like a criminal, his eyes darting around the waiting room, avoiding the gaze of the other couples who were there for their own difficult choices. When Tenny's name was called, she stood up without looking at him, her movements mechanical and distant. He sat in the plastic chair for 2 hours, the ticking of the wall clock sounding like the rhythmic striking of a hammer against his soul. He thought of the chief's burial, the red earth falling onto the casket, and he realized with a sickening clarity that he was participating in another kind of interment. When Tenny finally emerged, she looked pale, her spirit seemingly diminished by the clinical efficiency of the act. They drove back to the apartment in a silence, so thick it felt like a third passenger in the car. He had won the argument. He had protected them from the burden of a child they couldn't afford. But as he helped her into bed, he realized that he had lost something far more valuable. He had destroyed the image of the protector he had worked so hard to build. He wasn't the man who provided. He was the man who subtracted. The silence in the apartment was no longer just about the lack of money. It was about the absence of a future they had just traded for a few more months of survival. The silence that followed the procedure was not a peaceful one. It was a pressurized, ringing void that seemed to amplify every ghost inhabiting the apartment. Timmy moved through the rooms like a man walking through a minefield of his own making, his eyes avoiding the spots where Tenny used to place her handbags or the kitchen counter where they once laughed about a future that now felt like a forbidden country. In the quiet, his father's voice became a permanent resident, no longer just a memory, but a narrator of his every failure. The chief's philosophy on masculinity had always been a rigid, unyielding structure. A man was a provider, a fortress, a person whose value was measured in the height of the walls he built around his family's vulnerability. By forcing the difficult choice, Timmy realized he hadn't just protected his dwindling resources, he had inadvertently adopted the coldest parts of his father's soul. He had prioritized the idea of being a stable man over the actual life he had created, and the irony was a bitter metallic taste in the back of his throat. He would sit in the dark, the 010 hunger gnawing at his ribs, and wonder if the chief had ever faced a choice that required sacrificing a piece of his own heart to keep the monument of his name standing. The shame was a physical presence, a heavy igbada of regret that he couldn't strip off, making every breath feel like he was inhaling the red dust of his father's grave all over again. This psychological haunting began to manifest in his dreams, where he would find himself back in the village, standing before the chief's locked study, only to find the door was made of ultrasound images and eviction notices. He was a man of 33 who had built a career on strategic foresight and risk management, yet he had failed to manage the most basic human risks of love and legacy. He began to see his father not as the villain of his childhood, but as a mirror of his own potential for coldness. The realization was terrifying. He had spent his whole life trying to be different from the man who beat him for crying, only to become the man who silenced a life because he was too afraid of the struggle. He looked at his hands and saw the chief's knuckles. He heard his father's cadence in his own sighs. The manhood he had been taught was a trap, a cycle of stoicism that required the amputation of one's own emotions to remain strong. As he paced the apartment that he was technically trespassing in, the 7-day eviction notice having long since expired into a precarious grace period, he realized that he was no longer fighting for his wealth or his status. He was fighting for his soul, trying to find a version of himself that didn't require the chief's approval or the chief's cruelty to exist. The dawn felt further away than ever because he was still carrying the night inside him. Tenny became a ghost in the house, a shadow that moved with a heartbreaking, mechanical grace. She didn't scream, she didn't accuse, and she didn't demand the apologies that Timmy was too paralyzed to offer. Instead, she retreated into a silent season, a period of emotional withdrawal that felt more devastating than any explosive argument could have been. She would come home from her teaching job, set her bag down with a muted thud, and retreat to the bedroom, her eyes fixed on a point just beyond the reality of their shared misery. Timmy would try to cook for her, pathetic attempts at making jollof rice with the last of the parboiled grains and a single sachet of tomato paste, but the food would sit untouched, a cold monument to his inability to nourish her. The connection that had once been their greatest asset, the us against the world fire that had sustained them through the early days of his financial collapse, had been extinguished by the cold clinical air of the Yaba Clinic. He wanted to hold her, to tell her that he was sorry, to promise her that he would fix it all, but the Lagos iron in his soul was still too brittle. He was a man who didn't know how to apologize without also providing a solution, and since he had no solution for their poverty, he remained as silent as she was. The silence between them was filled with the sounds of the city, the distant hum of generators, the aggressive honking of danfos, and the rhythmic calling of the night watchman. But inside the apartment, the air was stagnant. Timmy watched her from the doorway of the bedroom, seeing the way she clutched a pillow to her stomach in her sleep, a subconscious mourning for the first seed that he had negotiated away. He realized that in his desperate attempt to be the man his father wanted, he had failed to be the partner Tenny needed. He had treated their life like a balance sheet, subtracting the cost of a child without factoring in the value of hope. The silent season was a mirror reflecting his own cowardice. He saw a man who was so afraid of being seen as a failure that he had become one in the most fundamental way. Every time he looked at her, he saw the red mark of the eviction notice and the red earth of his father's grave, all blurring into a singular narrative of loss. He was 33, starving, about to be homeless, and now he was losing the only person who had ever looked at him without a title or a bank balance in mind. The cliffhanger of their relationship wasn't whether they would break up, but whether there was anything left of Temmie to save once the silence finally became permanent. Life, particularly in a place as chaotic and resilient as Lagos, has a way of mocking the best-laid plans of desperate men. Just 3 weeks after the procedure in Yaba, as the silent season was beginning to feel like a permanent winter, Tenny collapsed in the small hallway near the kitchen. Temmie, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, carried her to the bed, his mind racing through every medical horror story he had ever heard. He thought it was an infection, a delayed reaction to the procedure, or perhaps the physical manifestation of her broken heart. But when she regained consciousness, her eyes weren't filled with pain. They were filled with a terrifying, wide-eyed confusion. A visit to a different clinic, this one a crowded, noisy facility in Suralere, where the air was thick with the smell of menthol and hope, delivered the news that felt like a glitch in the universe. Tenny was pregnant again. The doctor, a harried woman with gold-rimmed glasses, explained the biological rarity of it, mentioning superfecundation or a missed twin, but to Temmie, it felt like a supernatural ambush. The second seed had taken root in the very soil he had tried to salt. It was as if the universe was refusing to accept his difficult choice, handing him back the very responsibility he had tried to discard with a stubborn, miraculous insistence. The shock was so profound that Temmie didn't even feel the usual surge of financial panic. Instead, he felt a strange, vibrating fear, a sense that he was no longer in control of his own narrative. He looked at Tenny, and for the first time in weeks, the silence between them was broken by a sound that wasn't a sob or a sigh. It was a laugh, a dry, hysterical sound that escaped Tenny's throat as she sat on the crinkly paper of the exam table. "You tried to kill it, Temmie," she whispered, her voice devoid of malice, but heavy with a new kind of authority. "But God is not finished with us." This second seed wasn't just a pregnancy. It was a challenge to his masculinity, a divine rejection of the chief's way. But the doctor's expression shifted then, the professional mask tightening as she looked back at the scan. "There is something else," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "Tenny, you have a significant fibroid growing alongside the gestational sac. It's large, and it's positioned in a way that makes this a very high-risk situation." The cliffhanger was no longer about money or eviction. It was a matter of life and death. This second seed had come with a thorn, a biological battle for space that would require more than just manly stoicism to survive. The medical diagnosis was a labyrinth of terrifying possibilities that Temmie was ill-equipped to navigate. The fibroid was not just a growth. It was a predator within the womb, a benign but aggressive mass of tissue that was competing with the fragile new life for blood and space. The doctor explained the risks with the clinical detachment that only Lagos doctors can muster: red degeneration, premature labor, internal hemorrhaging. Every word felt like a physical strike against Temmie's chest. He sat in the cramped consultant's office, the sounds of the Suralere traffic filtering through the louvres, and realized that his previous problems, the eviction, the 010 diet, the chief's estate, were luxuries compared to the visceral reality of Tenny's health. He was a man who had prided himself on fixing things, but he couldn't fix a cellular malfunction. He couldn't strategy his way out of a high-risk pregnancy. For the first time, the Iron Boy felt completely, utterly useless. He looked at Tenny and saw not just the woman he loved, but a battlefield. The fibroid was a physical manifestation of the year's stress, a knot of tension that had hardened into meat, and it was threatening to take everything he had left. The cost of the required care was a mountain he couldn't even begin to climb. Weekly scans, specialized medications to keep the uterus quiet, and the looming shadow of a mandatory C-section at a high-end facility because the local clinics wouldn't touch a fibroid pregnancy. Temi walked out of the hospital into the blinding Lagos sun, the heat feeling like a personal insult. He had exactly 4,200 Naira in his pocket and a medical bill that would eventually run into the millions. He thought about the chief's burial, the millions spent on whiskey and lace, and he felt a primal scream rising in his throat. The diagnostic year was stripping him of his last shred of ego. He couldn't keep this to himself anymore. The burden was too heavy for a single set of shoulders, even ones trained by the chief. He looked at Teni, who was walking slowly, her hand instinctively shielding her lower abdomen, and he saw a strength in her that he had never bothered to cultivate in himself. She wasn't looking for a provider in that moment. She was looking for a partner. But Temi was still stuck in the loop of his father's voice, telling him that if he couldn't pay the bill, he wasn't allowed to lead the family. The diagnosis wasn't just for Teni's womb. It was a diagnosis of Temi's soul, a man who would rather lose everything than admit he was powerless. While Temi was spiraling into a logistical and financial abyss, Teni began a transformation that he found both baffling and intimidating. She didn't look at the bank statements or the medical pamphlets with the same dread that he did. Instead, she turned toward a power that Temi had always viewed as a woman's crutch, the deep, visceral spiritual warfare of a Nigerian woman in crisis. She didn't just pray. She went into a prayer closet, a literal and metaphorical space where she negotiated with the divine for their lives. He would wake up at 2 a.m. to find her kneeling on the cold tiles of their living room, her voice a low, rhythmic hum of petitions and decrees. She wasn't asking for money or a new house. She was commanding her body to be a sanctuary instead of a tomb. She was praying through the fibroid, speaking to the mass of tissue as if it were a sentient enemy that had to be evicted. Temi would watch her from the shadows, feeling like an intruder in a holy war. He had been taught that power was something you seized with your hands and your intellect, but Teni was demonstrating a power that came from surrender and an unshakable belief in the unseen. This spiritual intensity began to change the atmosphere of the apartment. The red mark of the eviction notice seemed to lose its power, and the silent season was replaced by a season of focused, spiritual aggression. Teni's prayers weren't soft. They were the prayers of a woman who had already lost one child and was refusing to give up the second. She began to involve Temi, not by asking for his opinion, but by demanding his presence. "Sit with me," she would say, her eyes burning with a fire that made the chief's temper look like a candle flame. For the first time, Temi began to pray, not because he believed in the words at first, but because he believed in her. He felt the Lagos iron in his heart beginning to melt, replaced by a raw, uncomfortable vulnerability. He realized that his father's version of strength was a hollow shell compared to the formidable duo they were becoming in that dark living room. The cliffhanger wasn't whether the prayers would be answered, but whether Temi was capable of truly letting go of his pride to join her in the battle. The prayer closet was the womb of their comeback, the place where the year before the dawn finally began to see the first faint cracks of light in the eastern sky. The change didn't start with $1 million contract. It started with a little win that was so small it felt like a joke, yet it was the most important 50,000 Naira Temi had ever earned. It came from an old contact, not Cunnel, but a junior staffer he had once mentored named Bimbo, who called him out of the blue to ask for a consultation on a small tech integration project for a startup in Yaba. Temi almost said no, his pride whispering that he was a chief's son who didn't do freelance gigs for peanuts. But then he looked at Teni's medication list and the empty pantry, and he silenced the voice of the chief for good. He spent 3 nights working on a cracked laptop, his mind sharpening for the first time in a year, the Lagos spirit finally working for him instead of against him. When the alert hit his phone, credit, NGN 50,000.00, he didn't feel like a big man. He felt like a survivor. He didn't spend it on himself. He bought a carton of milk for Teni, a bag of rice, and 2 of the expensive injections needed to manage the fibroid. The feeling of providing, truly providing from the sweat of his brow, rather than the momentum of his past, was more intoxicating than any of the big man's success he had known at 29. A 3-month extension, his voice steady and devoid of the desperation that had once defined him. The little win gave him the momentum to start reaching out to other contacts, no longer as a former CEO looking for a handout, but as a seasoned expert who had been through the fire and was ready to build something new. The cliffhanger was whether this momentum could be sustained, or if the year before the dawn had one last storm waiting to blow them off course. The momentum of their recovery was a frantic, high-stakes dance between the growing second seed and the expanding little wins. Timmy's freelance gig for Bimbo turned into a referral to a larger logistics company that was struggling with their digital infrastructure. He was no longer the arrogant 29-year-old who demanded a corner office. He was a 33-year-old hustler-in-chief who was willing to work from a plastic chair in a warehouse if it meant getting the job done. He began to accept Tenny's help, not just her prayers but her sharp, pedagogical mind. She began to edit his proposals, bringing a clarity and a human touch to his technical jargon that he had never possessed before. They were becoming a formidable duo, a partnership where his tactical skills and her emotional intelligence created something much stronger than the sum of its parts. For the first time, Timmy realized that his father's idea of a man, a solitary, unyielding pillar, was a recipe for collapse. Real strength was a bridge, a structure built on connection and mutual support. They were building a bridge over the wreckage of their past year, and the structure was holding. But the medical crisis was never far away. As Tenny reached her 6th month, the fibroid began to cause red degeneration, a painful condition that landed her in the hospital for a week of intensive monitoring. The bills began to outpace the little wins, and Timmy found himself back in the familiar territory of the 0-1-0 diet to ensure Tenny had the best care. But this time, the hunger felt different. It wasn't the hunger of a victim. It was the fasting of a warrior. He sat in the hospital corridor, his laptop on his knees, coding through the night, while Tenny slept under the influence of pain medication. He was no longer afraid of the nurses seeing him in his worn-out shoes or the doctors knowing he was struggling to pay. He had been stripped of his chief's son, identity, and had found something much more durable underneath, a father-to-be. The momentum wasn't just in the money. It was in the shift of his priorities. He realized that the year before the dawn had been a necessary pruning, a brutal but effective way to remove the fibroids of his own ego so that a new life, his own and his child's, could truly grow. By the 8th month of the pregnancy, Timmy and Tenny were no longer just surviving. They were a well-oiled machine of resilience and faith. The little win had evolved into a contract worth 5 million Naira, a sum that would have seemed impossible just 6 months prior. They didn't move into a bigger apartment or buy a new car. They cleared the debt, paid the hospital deposit in full, and set aside a safety net that didn't rely on the chief's ghost. They had become formidable, not because they had reached the pinnacle of success, but because they had reached the bottom and realized they could breathe underwater. Tenny's presence in the prayer closet was now a shared ritual. Timmy would kneel beside her. His hand on her protruding belly where the second seed was kicking against the fibroid with a stubborn, rhythmic insistence. They were two people who had looked into the abyss of a difficult choice and had chosen to fight for the second chance the universe had given them. The fibroid was still there, a physical reminder of the year's trauma, but it was being outgrown by the life next to it, a living metaphor for their own journey. The final weeks were a cliffhanger of biological suspense. The doctors were worried about the formidable duo surviving the delivery, as the fibroid had grown to the size of a grapefruit, threatening to cause a massive hemorrhage during the C-section. Timmy sat with the lead surgeon, a man who reminded him of his father, but with a kindness the chief never possessed, and listened to the risks. This time, Timmy didn't flinch. He didn't cry in secret or look for someone to blame. He took the surgeon's hand, thanked him for his expertise, and then went back to the room to pray with Tenny. They were ready. The year before the dawn had taught them that the outcome wasn't always in their hands, but the spirit in which they faced it was. They had buried the chief. They had faced the red mark. They had survived the silence. And they had turned a little win into a new foundation. As they rolled Tenny into the operating theater on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week they had visited the clinic in Yaba, Timmy looked at her and saw a queen. He was no longer a man of 33 crying like a child. He was a man of 33 standing like a mountain. The sound that broke the tension of the year before the dawn was the sharp, piercing cry of a baby boy, a sound that carried the force of 1,000 answered prayers and the final defeat of the chief's ghost. The C-section had been a battle. The fibroid had caused complications. The bleeding had been intense. And for a few terrifying minutes, the formidable duo had hovered on the edge of the ultimate loss. But the surgeon's hands were steady, and Tenny's heart was strong. When Timmy was finally allowed into the recovery room, he didn't see the machines or the blood-stained linens. He saw his son, wrapped in a simple white cloth, and his wife, pale but radiant with a victory that no bank account could ever match. He took the child in his arms, the second seed that had survived the salt and the thorn, and he felt a peace that surpassed understanding. The dawn wasn't a metaphor anymore. It was the light of the morning sun hitting the hospital window, illuminating a new version of Timmy. He was a father, a provider, and a partner, but most importantly, he was a man who had learned that true strength is found in the ability to bleed and still keep walking. The story of Timmy and Tenny didn't end with a return to the Lekki boy lifestyle. They stayed in their apartment for another year, the red mark long gone, but the lesson of the eviction notice permanently etched in their minds. Timmy's business grew, but it was built on a foundation of integrity and community rather than ego and competition. He eventually returned to the village, not to claim a first son's portion of gold, but to visit his mother and stand before his father's grave with a new perspective. He didn't apologize to the red earth anymore. He simply thanked it for the toughness it had forced him to develop. He realized that the chief had given him the iron, but it was Tenny and the second seed who had turned that iron into a sword. As he stood in the Ogun sun with his son in his arms, the boy looking at him with eyes that carried the chief's intensity but none of his cruelty, Timmy realized that the year of darkness had been the greatest gift he had ever received. The dawn had finally come, not because the sun had risen, but because he had finally learned how to carry his own light. I thought the abortion solved my problems. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, she's pregnant again, but this time, a massive tumor is fighting the baby for space. My landlord just threw my bags into the street, and my brothers are laughing at my father's grave. Is this God's karma for the first child, or a second chance I don't deserve? Most men would have ran, but I had to choose my ego or their lives. Click the link to see the miracle that happened in the hospital room, and why I'll never be the same. This is the year before the dawn.